Around 1700 before the Common Era, on a spring morning when the Mediterranean sun cast long shadows across the palace complexes of Crete, the earth itself betrayed the most sophisticated civilization the ancient Aegean had ever known. Minoans, named centuries later by archaeologists, Sir Arthur Evans, after the legendary King Minos, had built an empire of unprecedented elegance and power. Their vast palace at Knossos, sprawling across 6 acres of carefully terraced hillside, stood as the beating heart of a maritime civilization that had dominated trade routes, established colonies across the Aegean islands, and created art of breathtaking beauty. Yet on this morning the palace walls would tremble, and the fate of an entire culture would begin its inexorable descent into catastrophe. The Minoans called themselves something lost to history, their language linear, air remaining undeciphered to this day, despite more than a century of scholarly effort. What remains are their magnificent frescoes depicting bull-leaping ceremonies, their intricate drainage systems revealing engineering knowledge centuries ahead of their time, their elaborate religious sanctuaries suggesting a society where women held positions of extraordinary spiritual and political authority. The palace at Knossos alone contained over 1,000 interconnected rooms, built and rebuilt over 6 centuries of continuous habitation. Storage magazines held massive storage jars filled with olive oil, wine, grain, and honey, testament to a centralized bureaucratic system that controlled agricultural surplus across the island. The civilization that emerged on Crete around 3000 before the Common Era developed in splendid isolation. Protected by the sea from the constant warfare that plagued mainland Greece, while Bronze Age cultures on the Anatolian Peninsula and the Levantine coast fortified their cities with massive defensive walls. The Minoans built unfortified palaces open to the landscape. This absence of military architecture spoke to their confidence, to their naval supremacy, and perhaps to a fatal hubris. Their ships carried Cretan, pottery, metalwork, and textiles throughout the Mediterranean world, establishing trading posts from Cyprus to the Italian peninsula. Egyptian tomb paintings from the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III depict Keftiu, the Egyptian name for Cretans bearing tribute of elaborate vessels and precious goods, evidence of diplomatic relations with the most powerful kingdom of the ancient world. The palace societies operated through a sophisticated administrative system recorded on clay tablets in Linear A and later Linear B scripts, according to archaeological evidence interpreted by scholar Cynthia Shelmardine in her comprehensive studies of Aegean Bronze Age economies. These tablets reveal meticulous record-keeping of agricultural production, textile manufacturing, and religious offerings. The bureaucracy tracked everything from sheep herds in distant pastoral settlements to the allocation of bronze tools to craftsmen working in palace workshops. This centralized control meant prosperity and stable times, but it also meant that when catastrophe struck, the entire social structure teetered on the edge of collapse. Religious life permeated Minoan culture. Mountain peak sanctuaries dotted the Cretan highlands. Worshippers left offerings of clay figurines depicting devotees with arms raised in supplication. Cave sanctuaries in the island's interior received votive offerings spanning centuries. The most enigmatic aspects of Minoan religion centered on bull imagery, the powerful animals depicted in frescoes showing young athletes vaulting over charging bulls, in what must have been ceremonies of extraordinary danger and sacred significance. Whether these performances represented religious initiation, aristocratic display, or appeasement of chthonic deities remains debated, but they reveal a culture that embraced risk, that celebrated the liminal space between human control and natural chaos. The palace at Knossos housed workshops, producing luxury goods carved ivory, gold jewelry, elaborate stone vessels carved from imported Egyptian alabaster. Artisans created faience figurines of a bare-breasted goddess holding writhing serpents, images that would inspire both reverence and later Greek myths of dangerous, powerful female deities. The palace walls displayed frescoes of blue monkeys, griffins, and processions of elegant figures bearing offerings. This was a society at its apex, confident in its permanence, unaware that the ground beneath its magnificent palaces harbored forces that would soon tear their world apart. The island of modern Santorini lay, 70 miles north of Crete, across the wind-dark Aegean. Once a thriving circular island with its own Minoan settlement at Akrotiri, Thera, concealed beneath its fertile soil, a volcanic chamber of unimaginable destructive potential. The volcano had slumbered for thousands of years while human civilization flourished on its slopes and across the surrounding archipelago. But deep within the Earth's crust, magma chambers swelled with molten rock, gas, and superheated steam. The pressure built incrementally year by year until the island itself became a geological time bomb whose detonation would rank among the most catastrophic volcanic eruptions in human history. The first warnings came as earthquakes. It's not the minor tremors familiar to any Mediterranean population, but sustained seismic activity that damaged buildings and terrified populations. Across the Cycladic Islands in northern Crete, at Akrotiri, the Theran Minoans responded with remarkable, prescient archaeological evidence reveals they began systematically evacuating their settlement, removing portable valuables and precious objects. The ruins preserved under volcanic ash contain no human remains, no hordes of abandoned jewelry, suggesting the population recognized the danger and fled before the final catastrophe. This evacuation represents one of the few merciful elements in an otherwise apocalyptic narrative. But if the Therans escaped, the populations of Crete, only 70 miles away, faced an inescapable doom. The eruption, when it came, exceeded the scale of any volcanic event in recorded Mediterranean history. Modern volcanologists classify the Theran eruption as a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. Comparable to the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 that caused global climate disruption and the infamous year without a summer. The volcano ejected an estimated 24 cubic miles of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere. The explosion could likely be heard across the entire eastern Mediterranean, a sound like the world itself splitting apart. The initial Plinian eruption column rose perhaps 25 miles into the stratosphere, spreading a darkness across the sky that would have seemed like the end of days to populations watching from Crete and the surrounding islands. Volcanic ash began falling like apocalyptic snow, initially as light pumice fragments that accumulated gradually, and increasingly as heavier tephra that built up on roofs, collapsed structures, and buried agricultural fields. The ashfall alone would have been devastating, poisoning water supplies, suffocating livestock, and destroying crops across eastern Crete. But this was merely the opening act of a multi-stage catastrophe. As the eruption progressed, the evacuation of the massive magma chamber beneath Thera created a void that the island's structure could not support. The caldera collapse that followed generated something far more immediately lethal than volcanic ash. A series of massive tsunamis that radiated outward across the Aegean at hundreds of miles per hour. The physics of tsunami generation from caldera collapse creates waves of extraordinary height and destructive power. Geological evidence from Cretan coastal sites reveals tsunami deposits layers of marine sediment, seashells, and beach material deposited far inland, sometimes as much as 400 feet above normal sea level. The harbor towns along Crete's northern coast settlements that served as trading posts and fishing villages, connected by maritime networks to the palace centers, would have had at most minutes of warning. The sea would have retreated suddenly as the tsunami trough preceded the wave crest, exposing the seafloor in an eerie withdrawal that likely drew the curious toward the beach in fatal fascination. Then the wall of water struck. Eyewitness accounts don't exist. Literacy in Linear A was confined to palace scribes, and no narrative texts in that script have been deciphered, but the archaeological record speaks with brutal clarity. Entire coastal settlements were obliterated, their buildings reduced to rubble, their populations drowned or crushed by the unimaginable force of water, moving at destructive velocity. The tsunamis struck Crete's northern coastline in successive waves, potentially reaching heights of 30 to 100 feet depending on coastal topography and distance from the epicenter. The palace complex at Katos Akros on the eastern coast shows evidence of sudden, catastrophic destruction consistent with tsunami impact. Storage rooms were found filled with marine sediment. Valuable objects lay where they fell, suggesting the inhabitants had no time to salvage precious goods before fleeing or perishing. The eastern end of Crete, closest to Thera, bore the brunt of the devastation with a ferocity that left archaeological layers of destruction still visible more than 3 millennia later. But the physical destruction, however catastrophic, represented only the immediate crisis. The Minoan civilization had evolved a complex, interdependent system that relied on coastal trade, maritime connectivity, and centralized palace redistribution of resources. The tsunamis destroyed the Minoan fleet, the warships and merchant vessels that had maintained their thalassocracy, their sea-based empire. Harbor installations were obliterated. Coastal warehouses containing trade goods accumulated over seasons of commercial exchange were swept away or buried under marine debris. The maritime infrastructure that connected Crete to its colonial settlements on Rhodes, Kythera, and other Aegean islands vanished in a single day of destruction. The agricultural catastrophe followed with slower but equally devastating consequences. It's the volcanic ash that blanketed eastern and central. Crete varied in thickness from a few inches in western regions to more than 4 inches in areas directly downwind of Thera. While volcanic ash eventually weathers into fertile soil, its immediate impact on agriculture is catastrophic. Fed ash buried young crops, rendering the spring planting completely lost. Poisoned grazing lands, killing sheep and cattle that consumed contaminated vegetation or drank from ash-polluted water sources. The olive groves and vineyards that formed the foundation of Minoan agricultural wealth were severely damaged, and these tree crops require years to recover productivity after such devastation. The palace bureaucracies faced an impossible crisis. Their meticulous record-keeping systems tracked resources that no longer existed. The storage magazines at Knossos held supplies, but these reserves had to feed not only the palace dependents, but also displaced populations from the destroyed coastal regions. The social contract that bound farmers and craftsmen to the palace system rested on the palace's ability to provide protection and ensure survival during hard times. With the maritime trade network shattered, with agricultural production devastated, and with coastal populations displaced and traumatized, that contract began to fracture under unbearable strain. Religious crisis compounded material disaster. The Minoans had built their civilization under the perceived protection of powerful deities, the Mother Goddess who held serpents, the divine bull whose iconography dominated their sacred art, the gods and goddesses honored at peak sanctuaries and cave shrines. The catastrophe raised theological questions that must have shaken the foundations of Minoan faith. What transgressions had provoked such divine wrath? What offerings could appease powers capable of such destruction? The intensification of religious activity in the decades following the eruption, evidenced by increased votive offerings at sanctuaries, suggests a population desperately seeking divine favor through ever more elaborate ritual. The demographic impact remains difficult to quantify precisely, but the loss of life must have been staggering. Coastal populations died in the tsunamis. Inland populations faced starvation as agricultural systems collapsed. The centralized palace economy that had fed thousands of dependent artisans, bureaucrats, priests, servants, could no longer sustain those populations. Evidence from palace destruction layers suggests not a single catastrophic abandonment, but rather a gradual decline punctuated by episodes of violence. At some palace sites, archaeological evidence reveals deliberate destruction, burned storage rooms, smashed pithoi, signs of looting and chaos that suggest social breakdown rather than natural disaster. The Minoan civilization didn't end immediately after the Theran eruption. The palaces were rebuilt, at least partially. Life continued, but fundamentally transformed. The confident, outward-looking thalassocracy that had dominated Aegean trade had received a wound from which it would never fully recover. In the century following the Theran catastrophe, a new power emerged on the Greek mainland. The Mycenaeans, named after their principal citadel at Mycenae in the Argelid Peninsula, had long existed in Crete's shadow. Influenced by Minoan art and culture, but lacking their maritime dominance and sophisticated palace culture, where the Minoans had built open, unfortified palaces celebrating their connection to the landscape, the Mycenaeans constructed massive fortress citadels with walls of such enormous stone blocks that later Greeks believed them built by the Cyclopes. This fundamental architectural difference revealed contrasting worldviews, the Minoans confident in their naval supremacy, the Mycenaeans expecting threats and preparing for warfare. The weakened state of Crete after the Theran eruption created an opportunity that the Mycenaeans exploited with strategic calculation. Whether this represented outright military conquest, gradual infiltration, and intermarriage with Cretan elite families, or economic domination through control of maritime trade remains debated among scholars. The archaeological evidence reveals a complex transition rather than a sudden invasion. Around 1450, before the Common Era, the administrative language at Knossos changed from linear A still, undeciphered, to linear B, an early form of Greek that can be read by modern scholars. This linguistic shift represents nothing less than the administrative takeover of Crete's primary palace by Mycenaean Greeks. The linear B tablets from Knossos reveal a changed society. The religious terminology includes Greek deities, Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus, demigods who would dominate classical Greek religion. The social hierarchy reflected in these tablets shows a more militarized structure than earlier Minoan society, with references to military contingents and defensive preparations absent from the earlier linear A archives. The economic records track similar products: textiles, agricultural goods, livestock, but the overall impression suggests a more extractive system, with the palace demanding contributions from subject populations, rather than redistributing resources in the reciprocal pattern characteristic of Minoan administration. The palace at Knossos, during this Mycenaean period, underwent significant modifications. The throne room, that chamber with its carved gypsum throne and flanking griffin frescoes, may date to this period of Mycenaean control. The throne itself, with its high back and austere design, contrasts sharply with the fluid, artistic style of earlier Minoan art. Some scholars interpret this room as evidence of a new political ideology, with a single masculine ruler replacing the more collegial or religiously mediated authority structures suggested by earlier Minoan iconography, where powerful female figures dominated religious imagery. The subordinate palaces at Phaistos, Mallia, and Cato-Zakros were not rebuilt to their former glory after the destructions of the mid-15th century before the Common Era. This centralization of power at Knossos, under Mycenaean control, represents a fundamental restructuring of Cretan political geography, the island that had supported multiple palace centers, each controlling distinct regions but participating in a shared culture, now found itself dominated by a single center, controlled by foreign overlords who spoke a different language and worshipped different gods. The material culture of this period reflects the hybridization of two traditions. Pottery styles combined Minoan elegance with Mycenaean martial imagery. Weapons burials became more common, reflecting the Mycenaean warrior aristocracy's values. The peaceful bull-leaping ceremonies depicted in earlier frescoes gave way to imagery of combat and hunting themes central to Mycenaean masculine identity. The linear B tablets from this period, translated by Michael Ventris and John Chadwick in the 1950s, a breakthrough that revolutionized our understanding of Bronze Age Greece, revel an administration preoccupied with military preparations, armor production, and chariot maintenance. Yet the Mycenaean dominance of Crete proved relatively brief in historical terms. Around 1400 or 1375, before the common era dating remains contested, the palace at Knossos suffered a massive destruction by fire. The clay tablets in the archives were baked hard by the intense heat, ironically preserving them for modern discovery while the palace itself burned. Whether this destruction resulted from internal revolt, external attack, or accidental conflagration remains uncertain. What seems clear is that Knossos never again functioned as a major administrative center. The destruction of Knossos marked the effective end of palace civilization on Crete. The elaborate administrative systems collapsed entirely. The literacy that had been confined to palace scribes disappeared with the burning of the palace archives. Linear B tablets date from later periods on Crete. The archaeological record reveals a dramatic simplification of material culture, a decline in artistic quality, and a fragmentation of political authority. The island entered what scholars term the post-palatial period, characterized by smaller, defensively positioned settlements often located on hilltops rather than the accessible locations of earlier palaces. The population of Crete appears to have declined substantially during the centuries following the final palace destructions. Some scholars attribute this to emigration, suggesting that Cretans fled the island's instability for other regions of the Mediterranean. Others point to subsistence crises caused by the breakdown of the redistributive economic system that had supported specialized craftsmen and large concentrated populations. The archaeological evidence reveals abandoned settlements, diminished trade connections, and a general impoverishment compared to the palace period's prosperity. Yet even as the historical Minoans faded from the Mediterranean world, their cultural impact resonated through the civilizations that followed. The Mycenaeans had absorbed substantial Minoan cultural influence during their period of dominance. Minoan artistic motifs, religious symbolism, and architectural concepts filtered through Mycenaean culture into the broader Greek world. When the Mycenaean palaces themselves collapsed during the catastrophic upheavals of the Late Bronze Age, around 1200 before the Common Era, part of the broader Mediterranean-wide crisis that destroyed the Hittite Empire and shook Egypt to its foundations. The memory of these ancient palace civilizations persisted in oral tradition. The Greeks of the classical period, living centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, remembered dimly a previous age of powerful kingdoms and mighty citadels. The massive walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, which no classical-era Greek could imagine constructing, were attributed to the Cyclopes. The labyrinthine ruins of Knossos, still visible in historical times before being buried by later depositions, inspired stories of a different sort, tales of a terrible labyrinth built by the master craftsman, Daedalus, to contain the monstrous Minotaur, a creature half man and half bull, that demanded tribute of Athenian youths until slain by the hero Theseus. These myths preserved distorted memories of historical realities. The bull imagery that dominated Minoan religious art transformed into the monstrous Minotaur. The complex, multi-roomed palace structure became a bewildering labyrinth from which escape proved impossible. The tribute demands that a powerful Cretan thalassocracy, likely extracted from subject populations, became the horrific sacrifice of young people to feed a monster. King Minos himself, who may represent a title rather than a single historical individual, became in Greek mythology a figure of judgment and power, so righteous that after death, he served as one of the judges of the underworld. The tragic arc of Minoan civilization offers profound lessons about the fragility of even the most sophisticated societies. A culture that flourished for nearly 2,000 years. It created an art of timeless beauty. It engineered complex water management systems and established a maritime empire, proved vulnerable to catastrophic natural disasters beyond human control. The Theran eruption and resulting tsunamis and agricultural collapse weakened the civilization to the point where it could no longer resist foreign domination. The subsequent Mycenaean conquest demonstrated how disaster creates opportunities for rivals to exploit weakness. Perhaps most significantly, the Minoan collapse reveals the dangers of centralized, specialized societies dependent on complex trade networks and bureaucratic redistribution. When those systems broke down, the population lacked the resilience to adapt. The palace scribes could record meticulous inventories, but couldn't prevent the cascading failures that followed environmental catastrophe. The magnificent art and architecture concealed a fundamental vulnerability that only became apparent when crisis struck. The Minoans built a civilization of remarkable beauty and sophistication on an island positioned directly in the path of one of history's most powerful volcanic eruptions, geography that proved their ultimate tragedy.
Ow.
Their ruins remain, testament to both human achievement and the often cruel indifference of natural forces to human ambition.